Welcome to the best of first-person episodes from Phantoms and Monsters. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of all future uploads.
The Hatman. I saw him, the Hatman, once when I was around 5 years old, 1970. I was spending the night at my grandparents'. This is the first time my story is going public. I'm 53 years old now. Okay, I always slept with my grandma in her room. My grandpa was in the next room. All of a sudden I see a tall man with a cowboy hat on like in westerns. It was really dark in the room, the person was darker than the night. It was a tall figure. Remember, I was around 5. It stood next to the bed where my grandma was at. I thought it was my grandpa. These are my exact words I spoke that night. Grandpa, I see you. I see your hat. My grandpa wore a cowboy hat and he was tall, but this man said nothing. He just stood there. Then my grandma said, "Who are you talking to?" I said, "Grandpa, he's right there by you." She said, "There's no one there." I said, "Yes, there is. It's Papa." So she reaches under the bed and grabs the flashlight and turns it on. It's not there anymore. She could not see it. As soon as she turned flashlight off, there it was. Now I'm scared. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the man. It was gone. My grandma took flashlight away from me and said, "Go to sleep." And there he was again. She could not see it. It then slowly, I mean very slowly, started moving. Not walking but moving without taking steps, going around the bed to my side, which was where our heads were, not my feet. The foot of the bed was against the wall. At least 10 or 20 minutes had passed. I couldn't tell the time then, but now that's what I figured, and I put my head under the covers. I was saying, "Grandma, turn the light on. It's coming over to my side." All I could do was put the blanket over my head. I don't know how long I stayed awake that night, but I did fall asleep, and when I woke up, it was almost daylight, still dark, but light enough to see the wallpaper on the wall. I turned to look at Grandma. She's not in the bed. She was cooking breakfast for my grandpa and making his lunch. I was alone and terrified. The door to the kitchen was closed, and then you won't believe what happened. I saw him and saw one with a hoodie on.
Hatman in my dorm. It's funny how time works. I saw something strange 20 years ago which I didn't even know was strange until recently. I was listening to a podcast which rekindled a long-forgotten memory. The particular episode was about shadow people, mysterious dark figures which sometimes show up in and around people's homes. I vaguely remember reading something about them a couple of years ago, but they themselves didn't spark any memories for me. However, it was one type of shadow person in particular, Hatman, which caused me to do a double take while listening. Rewinding to the spring of 1997, I was a freshman at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. My dorm room was located on the 3rd floor of the rather drab-looking. It was early, with the faint blue light of morning just beginning to seep through the crack between the window and the curtain. It might have been the weekend because I recall my roommate had gone home and was not there that morning. I opened my eyes, and the first thing I noticed was a figure sitting next to my bed no more than 3 or 4 feet away. The beds in the dorms were set lower to the ground than a typical bed would have been, so I had a clear line of sight, and it's a sight I'll now never forget. The figure was sitting on the floor with his back up against the bed. His feet were flat on the floor with his knees pointing straight up. His arms were resting on his knees casually, and he appeared to be looking slightly down. I couldn't make out the details of any clothing, all I saw was a deep black body. But the feature that was most dominant, and why I'm referring to the figure as a he, was the white-brimmed hat he was wearing. I could not make out a face, mostly because the brim of the hat was obscuring it from the side. I had to blink hard a couple of times to ensure that my eyes were clear, but when I did, he was still there. My next cogent thought was that a drunk person had stumbled into the wrong room and passed out. After all, this was college. The problem with that, however, was I always locked my door at night. "Hello," I said in an aggressive tone, trying to convey that I was clearly unhappy with a stranger intruding in my room. After a second or two, but what felt like a minute or two, the figure slowly faded away, the spot where he was sitting visibly lightening as he did. At the time, it was weird because before that I had never had a groggy dream-like vision which I knew some people had when they woke up in the morning or in the middle of the night. 20 years later, and I still have not had any drowsy visions. That morning was the only time I have ever experienced anything like that. Even though it was a one-time occurrence, it was obvious to me that, for whatever reason, my brain had indeed conjured up an early morning foggy illusion, and I didn't think about it nearly at all for the next 2 decades. But just recently, more or less exactly 20 years after that morning, I learned about the ghostly entity known as Hatman. Upon hearing the first description while listening to that podcast, I immediately thought of the shadow-like figure I had seen that morning in my dorm room at Rutgers. The parallels with dozens of accounts were there. The figure I had seen had that large brimmed hat, was darker than the darkest black, and was spotted near my bed. What's the probability that my subconscious decided to create such an image 20 years before I even knew an almost identical being existed in the paranormal world? That memory, which has basically lain dormant for the past 20 years, has now taken on a whole new level of eeriness for me. Keith in New Jersey.
I assumed that this was Jeepers Creepers, but it's Hatman. I just recently started doing my research on this individual called the Hatman. I'm 20 now and I encountered this individual when I was 7 years old, 2004, one hot summer night in Palmdale, California. To be completely honest with you, over the years, even with such a traumatic experience at the time, the memory of what happened has become faint, especially at this age. At the time, a movie came out by the name of Jeepers Creepers, and the night of was my first time seeing the movie, and just like any other child at that age, when I saw this individual because of the trench coat and black brimmed hat, I assumed that this was Jeepers Creepers himself. Note that there is a sequel to the movie where Jeepers reveals his true self, but in the first one, the one that I'm talking about, he had this trench coat on with this brimmed hat setup, so me being a kid with the imagination that I had, I explained to my parents that this person looked like Jeepers Creepers. Of course, since I was only a child, my mother told me to stop watching horror films, but I honestly knew that this individual was certainly not Jeepers Creepers. I knew he was something else for him to come at the time of night that he did, and to have a malicious vibe about him. Sundra P.
Black suit wearing Hatman. After hearing these stories, I'm wondering if I made a mistake identifying an entity my daughter saw. We had moved to a new rural area. Our house was out in the woods, nearby was walking trails. Having walked nature trails deep in the woods in our hometown, my daughter, 6 years old at the time, and I were well acquainted with the woods. As we began the hike, my daughter started freaking out and trying to grab my camera to take a picture of the monster she said was further down the trail. I let her take a few pictures. One came out normally, one was completely black, but I don't know if she had covered the lens with a hand or hit the button before taking the cover off. Having had experiences like this before, I quickly got her back to the car. On the way home, I asked her about what she had seen. She described a man in a tall hat, dressed all in black with black shiny shoes and a black cape. I asked her if had any other colors on. She placed her hand on her chest and said it was white right there. She didn't point directly to her throat but to her chest in general. She also said he was from the Empire and lived in the classrooms, that he spoke like my uncle. My uncle is from Scotland and hated children. How all of this was communicated to her in the few moments we were on the trail is still beyond me. I assumed the white was a priest's collar due to the proximity of an old mental asylum that was at one time a school ran by nuns and priests after the asylum closed. I didn't see anything. She wasn't the type to make these things up. I had told her several times that just because I couldn't see something didn't mean it was there. That was very important that she not make up stories, because if there was something there I had to know so I could protect her. Again, we had experienced situations where she would see things her father and I couldn't. We have both explained several times how important it was she not make anything up. Also, she wasn't familiar with the vocabulary she used. She had asked me what few of the words said to her meant. I had explained what I could in the context she told them to me. Paramom.
The Hat Man with an Umbrella. The story I'm about to tell you is a truly terrifying experience that has since scarred me. When I was 14 years old, 23 now, I was having a very typical day. I just got home from a long day at school and was relieved to be able to relax and play some video games. I had set my backpack in the dining room and walked through the kitchen to the computer room. At this time I was home alone with both parents working and sibling out at friends. I sit down and begin to log in when I feel a sudden chill in the air. It made my hair stand on end, And so I look around suspiciously but find nothing. After a few minutes of surfing the web, I get on Facebook when suddenly the computer chair I'm in is forcefully pulled back and then tilted back while I'm still in it. At the angle I was at, I should have toppled over, but something was holding me there in place. From the force, my head whips back and I'm looking up when I see a shadow looking down at me. At that very second I screamed and then the chair fell forward. With my heart racing so fast I thought it would burst. I look back to a doorway and see something I will never forget. A tall man standing at about 6'4", maybe 6'6", staring at me. He was wearing an all-white suit with a white top hat and white umbrella. He was leaning on the umbrella like a cane in a suave kind of pose. The worst part was that no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see his face. The only feature I could see was his long blonde greasy hair and his inhuman stretched smile. It reminded me of the grin of the monster on the Disturbed album covers. After what seems like hours, he turns, unfurls the umbrella, giving me one final look, and walks upstairs. Immediately I called my dad and told him what happened. I know it was paranormal and not a robber because of the sinister feeling I had, which I had felt before. My dad told me to pray and said he would head straight home to check on me. After the day had passed and night arrived, I was still startled. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I finally drifted off. Around 3 a.m. I woke to a sudden freezing chill. My room was small, and my door overlooked the stairs, which I always left open. Standing at the top of the stairs was the same sinister being. Staring and smiling. He stood there for a while and just watched me as if harnessing my fear. I was paralyzed by fear, so I couldn't do anything. Eventually he turned and walked down the stairs with his umbrella. I can still picture him walking and seeing the umbrella through the stair banister bobbing up and down as he went down. He visited me 3 more times before we had a priest bless the house. After that I never saw him again. Still brings tears to my eyes when I think too deeply about it. I consider myself a very spiritual person because of other paranormal experiences I've had. Nothing as truly frightening as that. I named him the Umbrella Man. Now I wonder if he was a Hatman. I would do almost anything to never see him again. People tell similar stories of a Hatman that sounds a lot like this thing. I don't want anyone to ever have this experience. I know he has visited other people. Zev.
This is Lon Strickler. If you like this program, it would help us if you would give it a thumbs up. Then subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notification when we upload new first-person encounters. We have many more to come very soon. And by the way, if you have a suggestion or an experience of your own, please leave a comment.